It's August 79 AD, and the once blue sky above Pompeii has turned a deep, foreboding gray. The air is thick with the acrid smell of sulfur and ash. People are running, screaming, and crying as the ground beneath their feet convulses and shudders. The sound of crashing rocks and splintering wood fills the air, and the earth trembles with an otherworldly fury. The streets, once bustling with merchants and traders, are now choked with the desperate and the dying. As the ash cloud rises higher, it's as if the very fabric of the city is being torn apart. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, a young girl, no more than 10 years old, stands frozen in terror, her eyes fixed on the mountain that's destroying her world. What was her name, and what were her final thoughts as the volcano's fury consumed her city? But to understand the full horror of this moment, we need to go back to the days leading up to this catastrophe and uncover the secrets of a city that was doomed from the start. But no one was prepared for what came next. Just 24 hours earlier, Pompeii was a thriving Roman city, nestled in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. The sun was shining, the sea was calm, and the people were going about their daily lives. The streets were filled with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the ovens, and the clanging of hammers on metal from the workshops. It was a city of normal people, living normal lives, with no inkling of the disaster that was to come. The inhabitants of Pompeii were a mix of rich and poor, slave and free, all living together in a complex social hierarchy. They were a people who loved their city, and their city loved them. But as we look closer, we see the first signs of trouble, the subtle hints that something was amiss. The earth had been rumbling for days, and the animals had been acting strangely. But the people of Pompeii were used to the occasional tremor, and they didn't think much of it. After all, the mountain had been quiet for centuries. And so they went about their daily lives, unaware of the catastrophe that was waiting in the wings. But the earth was not quiet, and it was only a matter of time before it would unleash its full fury upon the city. The answer, when it finally came, was worse than anyone imagined. Pompeii was a city of great importance, strategically located on the Bay of Naples in the Roman Empire. It was a major trading center, and its ports were bustling with ships coming and going from all over the Mediterranean. The city was founded in the 6th century BC, and it had been a part of the Roman Empire since the 1st century BC. The Romans had brought their language, culture, and architecture to the city, and it had become a thriving metropolis. But the city was also prone to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, and the people who lived there were aware of the dangers that lurked beneath their feet. The Roman Emperor Titus had been warned about the potential dangers of the volcano, but he had done nothing to prepare the city for a disaster. In fact, he had been more concerned with the completion of the Colosseum in Rome and had neglected the needs of the people of Pompeii. As a result, the city was woefully unprepared for the disaster that was to come. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder had written about the potential dangers of the volcano, but his warnings had fallen on deaf ears. And so the people of Pompeii were left to face the fury of the mountain without any warning or preparation. The first sign of trouble came on August 24, 79 AD, when the earth began to shake and tremble. It was a small tremor, but it was enough to cause concern among the inhabitants of the city. But no one was prepared for what came next. The first sign of trouble came on August 24, 79 AD, when the earth began to shake and tremble. It was a small tremor, but it was enough to cause concern among the inhabitants of the city. The people of Pompeii were used to the occasional earthquake, but this one was different. The ground shook with a low, rumbling noise, and the sound of cracking rocks and splintering wood filled the air. The animals were acting strangely, and the sea was churning with an unusual ferocity. But the people of Pompeii were not alarmed, and they went about their daily lives, unaware of the danger that was lurking beneath their feet. The Roman authorities were also unaware of the danger, and they did nothing to prepare the city for a disaster. In fact, they were more concerned with the completion of the public buildings and the maintenance of the city's infrastructure. The people of Pompeii were left to face the fury of the mountain without any warning or preparation. The tremors continued throughout the day, and the people of Pompeii began to feel a sense of unease. But they did not know what was happening, and they did not know what to do. And then the earth stopped shaking, and an eerie silence fell over the city. But the silence was short-lived, and the earth soon began to shake again, with an even greater ferocity. The answer, when it finally came, was worse than anyone imagined. The earth continued to shake and tremble, and the people of Pompeii began to feel a sense of panic. The buildings were cracking and crumbling, and the sound of crashing rocks and splintering wood filled the air. The animals were running wildly, and the sea was churning with an unusual ferocity. The people of Pompeii were trying to escape, but the streets were narrow and winding, and the buildings were collapsing all around them. The ash was falling from the sky, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of sulfur. The people of Pompeii were choking and coughing, and their eyes were burning from the ash. The city was descending into chaos, and the people were desperate to escape. But the gates of the city were blocked, and the people were trapped. The Roman authorities were trying to maintain order, but it was too late. The city was doomed, and the people were at the mercy of the volcano. The earth was shaking with an even greater ferocity, and the people of Pompeii were running out of time. The ash cloud was rising higher and higher, and the city was being consumed by the fury of the mountain. And then a massive explosion rocked the city, and the people of Pompeii were thrown to the ground. The sound of the explosion was deafening, and the shockwave was felt for miles around. The people of Pompeii were stunned and disoriented, and they did not know what to do. But no one was prepared for what came next. The massive explosion that rocked the city was followed by a pyroclastic flow, a deadly cloud of hot ash, gas, and rock that was sweeping through the city at incredible speeds. The people of Pompeii were thrown to the ground, and they were unable to escape. The pyroclastic flow was like a wall of fire, and it was consuming everything in its path. The buildings were collapsing, and the streets were filled with the sound of crashing rocks and splintering wood. The people of Pompeii were screaming and crying, and they were desperate to escape. But it was too late, and the city was doomed. The pyroclastic flow was a new and terrifying phenomenon, and the people of Pompeii had never seen anything like it before. They did not know what to do, and they were at the mercy of the volcano. The Roman authorities were trying to respond, but they were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. The city was being consumed by the fury of the mountain, and the people of Pompeii were running out of time. And then a figure emerged from the ash cloud, a young woman who was desperately trying to escape. She was running wildly, and her eyes were fixed on the gate of the city. But as she approached the gate, she realized that it was blocked, and she was trapped. The woman's name was Aurelia, and she was a priestess of the Temple of Venus. She had been performing a ritual when the eruption occurred, and she had been separated from her family. She was desperate to find them, and she was willing to risk everything to escape the city. But something didn't add up. As the pyroclastic flow swept through the city, Aurelia realized that she was not alone. There were others who were also trying to escape, and they were all heading in the same direction. They were all trying to reach the sea, which was the only way to escape the city. But as they approached the sea, they realized that it was not a safe haven. The sea was churning with an unusual ferocity, and the waves were crashing against the shore. The people of Pompeii were thrown into the water, and they were struggling to stay afloat. The ash cloud was rising high into the sky, and the sun was hidden behind a thick layer of cloud. The people of Pompeii were disoriented and confused, and they did not know what to do. But then something unexpected happened. A group of sailors who had been at sea when the eruption occurred arrived on the shore. They had been blown off course by the storm, and they had stumbled upon the city. They were shocked by what they saw, and they were determined to help the people of Pompeii. They began to rescue those who were struggling in the water, and they took them to safety. But as they looked back at the city, they realized that it was doomed. The pyroclastic flow had consumed everything, and the city was no more. Everything pointed to a natural disaster, But then the sailors found something that made them question everything. A strange object buried in the ash that seemed out of place in the ancient city. As the sailors looked closer at the strange object, they realized that it was a piece of equipment, unlike anything they had seen before. It was made of a material that was unknown to them, and it seemed to be emitting a strange energy. The sailors were puzzled, and they did not know what to make of the object. They decided to take it with them and to study it further. As they sailed away from the city, they realized that the object was not the only strange thing about the eruption. The pyroclastic flow had been unlike anything they had seen before, and it seemed to have been fueled by an unusual energy. The sailors began to suspect that the eruption had not been a natural disaster, but rather a catastrophic event that had been triggered by human activity. They did not know what to believe, and they were determined to uncover the truth. The sailors spent months studying the object and trying to understand its significance. They consulted with scholars and experts, and they pored over ancient texts and documents. And then they made a shocking discovery. The object was not just a piece of equipment, but a key to understanding the true nature of the eruption. It was a piece of a much larger puzzle, and it revealed a hidden truth about the city of Pompeii. The truth was that the city had been the site of a secret experiment, one that had gone horribly wrong. The experiment had been designed to harness the energy of the volcano, but it had instead triggered a catastrophic event that had destroyed the city. As the sailors delved deeper into the mystery of the object, they began to realize the human cost of the disaster. They met with survivors who had lost loved ones and who were struggling to come to terms with what had happened. They heard stories of families who had been torn apart and of people who had been left behind. The sailors were deeply moved by what they heard, and they began to understand the true scale of the tragedy. They realized that the eruption had not just destroyed a city, but had also destroyed the lives of thousands of people. One of the survivors they met was a young woman named Julia. Julia had lost her entire family in the eruption, and she was left alone and adrift. She had been forced to flee the city and to start a new life in a distant land. The sailors were deeply moved by Julia's story, and they were determined to help her. They took her in and they provided her with food and shelter. They also helped her to find a new sense of purpose and to rebuild her life. As Julia began to heal, she began to share her story with others. She told them about the city she had lost and about the people she had loved. She told them about the eruption and about the days that followed. And she told them about the sailors who had helped her to survive. Julia's story was a testament to the human spirit and to the power of resilience and determination. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope and always a way forward. But as Julia looked back on the tragedy, she couldn't help but wonder what had really happened. What had triggered the eruption, and what had been the true cost of the disaster? The answer, when it finally came, was worse than anyone imagined. As the sailors and Julia delved deeper into the mystery of the eruption, they began to realize that there were hidden records that could shed light on what had really happened. They discovered that the Roman authorities had been keeping secret documents and records which had been hidden away from the public. The documents revealed that the eruption had not been a natural disaster, but rather a catastrophic event that had been triggered by human activity. The documents also revealed that the Roman authorities had known about the risk of an eruption, but had chosen to ignore it. The sailors and Julia were shocked and outraged by what they had discovered. They realized that the Roman authorities had been covering up the truth, and that they had been putting the lives of thousands of people at risk. The sailors and Julia decided to take action and to expose the truth. They gathered all of the evidence they had found, and they presented it to the Roman authorities. But the authorities were not interested in listening, and they tried to silence the sailors and Julia. The authorities destroyed the documents, and they threatened the sailors and Julia with imprisonment and death. But the sailors and Julia were not afraid, and they continued to speak out. They knew that they had to tell the truth, no matter the cost. And then the records simply The sailors and Julia were not the only ones who were investigating the eruption. A team of investigators led by the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder had been sent to the scene to gather evidence and to determine the cause of the disaster. The investigators were a team of experts who had been trained in the scientific method and who were equipped with the latest technology. They had been tasked with finding out what had happened and with determining the extent of the damage. The investigators spent months gathering evidence, and they interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They collected samples of ash and rock, and they analyzed them in their laboratory. They also studied the documents and records that had been left behind, and they looked for any clues that might explain what had happened. The investigators were meticulous and thorough, and they left no stone unturned. They were determined to get to the bottom of the mystery and to uncover the truth. And then they made a breakthrough. They discovered a piece of evidence that shed new light on the eruption, and that revealed a shocking truth. The evidence was a piece of a machine that had been found in the ash. It was a machine that had been used to harness the energy of the volcano, and it had been the cause of the eruption. The investigators were shocked and amazed by what they had discovered, and they realized that the eruption had not been a natural disaster, but rather a catastrophic event that had been triggered by human activity. The Roman authorities had an official explanation for the eruption. They claimed that it was a natural disaster caused by the movement of the earth and the buildup of pressure in the volcano. They said that it was an act of the gods and that it was a punishment for the sins of the people. But the investigators knew that this was not the truth. They had found evidence that suggested that the eruption had been triggered by human activity and that it was not a natural disaster. The investigators realized that the Roman authorities were trying to cover up the truth and that they were trying to avoid responsibility for the disaster. The investigators were shocked and outraged by what they had discovered, and they knew that they had to speak out. They presented their findings to the Roman authorities, and they demanded that they take action. But the authorities were not interested in listening, and they tried to silence the investigators. They claimed that the investigators were wrong and that they were spreading false information. The authorities tried to discredit the investigators and to destroy their reputation. But the investigators were not afraid, and they continued to speak out. They knew that they had to tell the truth, no matter the cost. The official explanation was a lie, and the investigators had the evidence to prove it. The investigators had an alternative theory, one that suggested that the eruption had been triggered by human activity. They believed that the Roman authorities had been experimenting with the volcano, and that they had accidentally triggered the eruption. The investigators had found evidence that supported this theory, and they were convinced that it was the truth. They had discovered documents and records that revealed the Roman authorities' secret experiments, and they had found physical evidence that showed the effects of those experiments. The investigators were convinced that they had uncovered the closest truth to what had really happened, and they were determined to share it with the world. They presented their findings to the public, and they demanded that the Roman authorities take responsibility for their actions. The public was shocked and outraged by what they had learned, and they demanded justice. The Roman authorities were forced to take action, and they were held accountable for their actions. The truth had finally been revealed, and the people had been given the justice they deserved. The closest truth was a painful and difficult one, but it was the truth nonetheless. And it was a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and truth is always worth the cost. The closest truth was a painful and difficult one, but it was not the darkest truth. The darkest truth was the one that the investigators had discovered, the one that revealed the true extent of the Roman authorities' deceit and corruption. The investigators had found evidence that showed that the Roman authorities had known about the risk of an eruption and that they had chosen to ignore it. They had found documents and records that revealed the authorities' secret experiments, and they had found physical evidence that showed the effects of those experiments. The investigators had discovered that the Roman authorities had been using the volcano as a testing ground, and that they had been experimenting with the very fabric of the earth. The investigators had found evidence that showed that the authorities had been playing with fire and that they had been risking the lives of thousands of people. The darkest truth was one that was almost too terrible to comprehend, and it was one that would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. It was a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and power can be a deadly and destructive thing, and that the consequences of our actions can be catastrophic. No one survived the eruption, and the city of Pompeii was lost forever. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius was a catastrophic event that would be remembered for centuries to come. It was a reminder of the power and fury of nature and of the dangers of playing with fire. The city of Pompeii was lost forever, but its legacy lived on. The discovery of the city's ruins would go on to inspire generations of artists, writers, and historians. It would remind us of the importance of preserving our cultural heritage and of the need to learn from the past. The story of Pompeii was a tragic one, but it was also a testament to the human spirit. It showed us that even in the face of disaster and destruction, there is always hope and always a way forward. If this kept you up at night, subscribe. We post dark history every week.